Oakville, be it over time or be it intermittently or be it immediately. Today's focus is going to be on anti-Black racism and shedding some light on the experiences of Black folks in Oakville. Before we do that, we want to make sure that we're sort of aligning ourselves and preparing our participation for today. And something that Nabeel and I covered in a previous session was our Indigenous welcomes and our Indigenous acknowledgements. So Nabeel and I, we thought it was important that we don't just read Indigenous acknowledgements, that we actually try and prepare something from our intention. So today I will lead our Indigenous acknowledgement. So very first off, I want to acknowledge that that Oakville, the land that we get to sort of enjoy and speak about each week, was not always Oakville. There was a time where other people were stewards of this land. There are Indigenous communities that were here long before us, long before it was Oakville. And it's important for us to, when we're doing these conversations, to extend gratitude to those folks for being stewards of the land, which we can now enjoy in a totally different way. I know I'd love to, open a window and show outside. I don't have that privilege in my office where I'm facing a window. But on the drive home today, I encourage everyone, as I will, to look outside and sort of enjoy what this land is now providing us and how stewards for thousands of years preserved a land in which we can enjoy now. And I can raise my daughter and my family in a place that is so fruitful and so positive and allows me to do what I love. So certainly acknowledging Mississaugas of the credit for providing us this opportunity and ensuring that the land we have now is so wonderful. And we can speak about today, in ways that we can make our community better on this wonderful land. So Nabeel, I'll hand it over to you, sir.
Thank you for that, Daniel, and thank you for being vulnerable to do a land acknowledgement that's actually coming from a place of learning and not necessarily from a place of reading. So I think it takes courage to do that, and I appreciate. And we're going to need some vulnerability and some courage to have meaningful conversations today. I'm sure you guys are wondering who is our esteemed guest today. So we have with us Janelle from Halton Black Voices. And just to let you know, Janelle Thomas is a Black Canadian woman,
Nabeel,
activist at, yeah.
you got to record this, buddy. We're going to share this on the town's YouTube, so make sure you're hitting record.
Oh yes, it's recording for
Oh,
sure.
sorry, you are. Thank you.
Yes, it's recording. Because people in the world need to know Janelle. And so, as mentioned, Janelle is Janelle Thomas is a Black Canadian woman, an activist, an athlete, a mother with a background in community organizing, labor studies, and creative visual merchandising. Raised in the Halton region, Janelle recognizes the need for wellness and educational programs to develop essential resources for marginalized groups in her community. Fueled by her passion for equity and social justice, Janelle founded Halton Black Voices earlier this year in an effort to develop policies and programs to address significant needs in Halton. In her work, she aims to work inclusively with Halton residents, business groups, and stakeholders to develop anti-racist programs for corporate and community groups. Janelle looks forward to deepening her connection with members of the Indigenous and 2LS LGBTQIA communities in all her work. She welcomes Halton residents to join Halton Black Voices, a grassroots collective to engage participants in Halton Black Voices anti-racist book club, healing circles, and equity learning spaces. I have read her bio, but we get to interact with her live. So Janelle, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. It's a bit rainy today, but I'm feeling good. Good.
Right. We have to give thanks for the weather that we have. It's at
That's
least
right.
not it's at least not snowing, I
Yeah.
suppose is the better way to look at it. But that being said, I know Daniel wanted to lead us off with a
Yeah,
question.
sure. So Nabeel had mentioned that you started earlier on this year, Halton Black Voices. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so it's very simple. Halton Black Voices is a new grassroots collective. We're intended to bring family, youths, and individuals together. Our purpose is to create a safe space within Halton region for all Black people, and like Nabeel said, including the 2SLGBTQIA community as well, where we can establish new connections. We also aim to build stronger communities by building awareness, empowering and educating the Black communities within Halton.
That's awesome. Any initiatives that has happened, like it's a collective of residents from Halton. Anything that you like to share about just the journey of creating that group, Janelle?
It was actually very it was a calling. It almost feels like it was a calling. So it wasn't as complicated as I thought it was going to be when I started it. I reached out to other community members. They were immediately ready to support in any way that they can. They know this is something that Halton needs, being a predominantly white region, to bring some sort of culture and ethnicity into those circles, into those power circles. So it's been a journey, but it's been great.
Right. And it's interesting you mentioned, right? Like this, like what is Halton and what is Oakville in particular. And so in the work that, Halton Black Voices is doing, what's the context of it in Halton, right? Like what does anti-Black racism look like in Halton?
Um, yeah, so in Halton, many white people spend their time with people that essentially are alike to them, and who share those experiences with them, which is other white people with privilege. They may have one or two racialized friends, but they don't always see the value in that long-term, deep relationship building with the Black community members or other racialized citizens or residents. So essentially what happens is that this translates to white people giving more opportunities to other white people in their circles. And I know many job opportunities have gone to white people who do not necessarily have the necessary lived experience to be effective in those roles, such as, a white man in a diversity officer or a diversity inclusion position, or even a white woman in an equity and diversity union rep. You can see how where opportunities present themselves and who those opportunities go to, usually the ones that are like you. And anti-Black racism is also reflected in the work of our local government. We still see predominantly white males in the majority of roles with power and within the municipal government in Halton, and they're largely representing their own interests. The mayors of Halton and Oakville are white men. The mayor in Burlington is a white woman. But when Halton Black Voices approaches these men with these issues that are important to Black and racialized people, such as maintaining a certain neighborhood, a marginalized neighborhood, marginalized communities, talking about defunding the police, they do not see the value in these initiatives, and because for them it has no value to them. So this crosses back to the lack of cross-racial relationships or friendships and the lack of understanding about these issues, which are important to Black residents, such as myself.
100%. I thank you for sharing that experience, and I think it's really critical to have honest conversations, right? To be able to say the experience of a person of color, of a Black resident in Halton as they have experienced it, right? I think sometimes we shy away from sharing our experiences or sharing your experiences or sharing the experiences of Black Voices Halton because it might make people uncomfortable. But I think the reality is that that's maintaining a certain power dynamic that, unless you challenge that narrative, unless you speak to your experience, will always remain in place. If you ever want to disassemble that, we have to have these
Yeah.
uncomfortable conversations that might make certain individuals vulnerable and that might give courage to other individuals to speak up, right? So I thank you for providing us with that space. Daniel, any feedback and sort of input on that?
Yeah, no, I think that the what you've provided, while subjective, is objectively accurate in terms of the representation we see. As a longtime Halton resident, when you mentioned, having, one or two individuals who are in your network who are Black, right, tends to form the representation of how you see those groups. And if you're not really, always interacting with new cultures and new people, it's difficult to embed a value in those things into your life. And that's where Halton, I think, sort of gets, and this is not, I'm not using this word to be critical, but kind of gets away with some passive racism because it's such a small population of 2, 3, 4% each year of Black population that the priority of being inclusive to these folks is really never incumbent on the individual, because it's your interactions are so few, that sort of changing your behavior or changing your life to be inclusive uh, never really has to occur, um, or doesn't occur with no consequences, just because it's such a small aspect of your life. And I think it's important, which is what Halton Black Voices is doing, is trying to bring some echo chambers to those voices to make sure that everyone sort of hears that experience is harmful, and is important, and it is incumbent on everyone, even in Halton, to sort of pick up the slack. Uh, I can
Right.
speak, and I'll just add an anecdote from our lens as well. For if folks are listening and they don't necessarily think that that racism is a challenge in Halton, because we experienced the accolades of 2018 best city in Canada to live in. I would challenge you to spend some time in some of the diverse communities in Halton. Nabeel and I have the privilege of spending time in some of our subsidized neighborhoods and some of our local food programs. And while our Black community is less than 5% of the population in Halton, I can assure you that 5%, like, the representation of Black folks in those spaces of subsidized housing communities, or our community food programs, is substantial. So to think that there is no issue of racism, I would point to those occurrences and say, well, how is it possible that this such a small group of people in our community is so overrepresented in something as simple as food security? How is that happening at not a systemic level? How is that a coincidence?
Yeah, Dan, that's a really good point. And Janelle, you mentioned you've been a resident of Halton. Was it your entire life in Halton that you spent, or a part of your life in Halton? But I would love to, if you're willing to speak to your experience as just a resident in Halton, uh maybe a minority in an otherwise predominantly white community. Like, what was that like?
Growing up Black in Oakville. So I actually moved here in grade 8. So I started grade 9 here. I'm originally from Mississauga. So I went from a very diverse space, Mississauga, to Oakville. And it was my first experience with blatant racism. Came from middle class Mississauga, essentially, just to acknowledge my privilege, and moving to Oakville, coming into a very white space, being told if I'm from the hood, if I'm from the ghetto, because I'm Black, and they've never essentially seen anyone Black before, I guess. So it was questions like that, and essentially, to go even deeper, I only gained the respect from a lot of students in high school because I was an athletic. I was an athlete. So played soccer, I played basketball. Then I eventually went into playing rugby. And that's how, I guess, people started to take notice in me, was because I was able to bring their team along, or even bring that sort of like intimidation factor, because now you have a Black girl on your team.
Hmm.
So that was a journey. And then also challenging like the internalized racism as well, right? So I was an academic. So I went to a school where they had 2 campuses. I went to a school called White Oaks with 2 campuses. And so I was on the academic campus, and a majority of the racialized or Black kids were on the North campus. So at that point, they had already been streamed out before I even got to build a relationship with them. We were on separate campuses. So it was definitely, the high school experience in Oakville was definitely an experience, to say the least.
Would you would you say to your experience that there's a notion of tokenization that happens
Oh,
as
100%. And in Oakville, that is the thing. Because you see certain people's bubbles, there is just one Black person in that bubble. Um, so it's a big tokenism, huge thing in Oakville.
and would you say that you brought in sports, right? And it's almost like when you talk about finding your voice or your purpose or your identity, and if that identity is connected to sports, which is often connected to performance, right? Did you ever find that like your identity as a black person and your desire and your to be athletic was somehow being perceived by others as like a stereotype that you need like a mold you need to fit and you need to perform at a level to maintain that identity? Did that ever happen to you,
Yes,
Janelle?
yes. So I need to be the fastest. I have to get the most tries in rugby. I had to get the most points. I was supposed to get the winning basket, things like that. Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
And was that easy? Was that easy as a young person to have to navigate that?
I mean, as a kid, all you're trying to do is fit in, right? It's so, I
Yeah.
loved playing sports. So if I got the most goals and people cheered for me, it is what it is. But as you get older, now when you self-examine and you reckon with that, you're like, oh man, like we all play a part in it, right? Whether we perform in it or not.
So,
Yeah.
Janelle, I know, Nabeel and I want to spend some time discussing sort of how organizations can shift in order to be more supportive. Before we go into that, because I know this is going to be shared primarily with residents and consumed by residents, in Halton and Oakville, what can residents on an individual level do to sort of curb or change that pattern of tokenism that we see in places like, yeah, Oakville?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a white parent with young children, look around and see who you're having your play dates with. And broaden that. If you go to the once we parks open up and events
Yeah.
open up, go to those cultural events. Right? It's great how Halton and Oakville have their own little nice street party, but go to the ones that are focused to a certain culture, to a certain heritage, and then and broaden your cross-racial friendships as an adult, as a parent as well. That's something that you have to do. It's going to be hard if essentially you've always been in white circles. It's definitely going to be hard, but as an individual, all you're doing is broadening your circle.
Right, and through the broadening of your circle, you broaden your perspective. You include within it, things that otherwise was hidden from you, right, or you were unaware of. We actually have a question from Sheena, and Janelle, if you would like to address this, by all means, and we are here to support as well. Is can you define tokenism?
So tokenism is a performative gesture where if you want to perceive yourself or the space that you're in as diverse, you would have essentially maybe one Black person, one Asian person, one brown person. That is tokenism. That is you are highlighting one person in your space as a reason for you to feel that you are doing some sort of work in diversity or equity.
Right, really, really well put, Janelle. And just to add to that, what tokenism does is that it maintains the status quo. It maintains the power imbalance that exists within systemically discriminatory practices. So the whole objective of tokenizing somebody is to put somebody in a position of leadership without authority, or of being visible but without having a voice, for example. So the idea here is that the person is there, but they don't have the influence. The influence is still maintained with the status quo. And so it's very dangerous when we start tokenizing anybody, for that matter, because you take away voice from that individual and you project on them what you expect them to be.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, Nabil, that's a huge component as well. Like if you give this person the responsibility of carrying a stereotype because you embody that onto them, like you really remove the opportunity for an identity from an individual because they're carrying on
Mhm.
whatever tokenized behavior you expect from them.
Yeah,
Right.
so a good example, personal example, my company was going through union negotiations and setting up for a potential strike. They like to set out strike captains. My union is like 95% white. And in 2020, they asked me to be a strike captain. I told them no, that was tokenism. And she was like, well, what does that mean? So I explained it to her. and she you know, she was a little fragile about it, but it's past now. But yeah, so that is an example of tokenism, is when you in the day-to-day operations, your voice doesn't matter, but when it comes to being in sort of spotlight or something like that, then that's when they want to use you. It's being used.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic as you transition away from, you know, the question is how do you transition away from tokenism when you have a population that might not be substantial in your overall population base, right? That's I've always wondered that myself, Jadil, or Daniel, or anybody within who's here today, guys. Thank you for joining us. You know, how do you move away from tokenism? What do you think is one of the ways we can do that?
A key strategy or practice is hire in threes. So don't just hire one Black person, hire three. So then they can also support each other as well. So that's also an example of how you can dismantle that.
Right. It speaks to representation and it speaks to, you know, I think power dynamics, right? The idea is you don't want to tokenize somebody, give them power,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And if that's a scary thing, then that speaks to the institutional, you know, systemic challenges, right? To feel like, why is it so difficult to give voice, to give power to individuals, right? And if we're afraid, then that's something that we have to navigate within ourselves. That we have to, you know, just like you said, expand our bubble, so to speak, right? Obviously, COVID, you know, you have to be careful of that. But the idea is you expand your bubble through your perspectives. And I think if not now, then when? I suppose is really the question, right? Like the unprecedented, you know, awareness of the Black experience in Canada and in the US, the Indigenous experience and other people of color, like it's time to take some action, right? And it's incumbent upon every one of us, right?
Yeah.
Myself included. And I know, Dan, we only have a couple of minutes. So with that question, I know, Dan, you got a question about allyship to Janelle, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's a huge part of why we asked you to come on. So for us as an organization or a corporation, Town of Oakville, and for those organizational representatives listening, how can we support? What do we got to do?
So I like to, talk about confronting allyship, because it's important to remember that white people cannot proclaim themselves to be allies, as it serves to recenter white people in someone else's struggle. Allyship is not an identity that can be borrowed when it feels comfortable or trendy. It is a lifelong journey. It is an ongoing journey. And being a true ally means you're practicing that every day of your life, whether Black people are in the room or not. That's an important part, especially when they're not in the room.
Yeah.
And it's also, it's about having those hard conversations, even within the four walls that you live in. It's one thing to go out in the streets with a sign that says defund the police, but you don't talk to your dad, who's a RCMP or a longtime cop, about defunding the police and why, and having those uncomfortable conversations. You have to understand that it is a privilege in itself just to have those conversations. Being in a form of uncomfortability is just uncomfortable. You're not unsafe. There's Black people out there that are unsafe because of what's happening in the streets. So it's always to check your privilege and to reckon with yourself with that as an ally, and again, be supportive, make space. So if you sit on some sort of diversity table and you see the diversity table is 80% white, speak up on that. Make some noise and say, guys, if you want to accomplish things, if you want to have a true impact, we need those diverse voices. We need those Black voices. Bring those people to the table. Bring those people to the table. If you don't have the power to bring those to make the space, then you have to carry those demands across, right? And support those voices in any way you can, especially when they're not there.
Right. I loved that you said, it's okay for us to be uncomfortable so that other people are feeling safe, right? And so I think that is so powerful, right? And if you really talk about power and privilege, I'm like, what's greater, right? For me to be uncomfortable to have a meaningful and real conversation, or for Black community to feel unsafe in their interaction with either the authorities or the criminal justice system or just their peers, right? The idea is, sometimes people can feel unsafe within a work environment, right? I don't know, if you have any advice for what can we do as an organization, or what can an individual do in their capacity as coworkers to make their, their Black coworker feel comfortable so that they don't have to feel unsafe.
Yeah, so with the town, you guys, in Community Corner, reach out, like as you guys are doing now, reaching out to Black communities, to Black organizations, and see how you guys can help us. So how we would have more Black people watch your show, like certain topics that are relevant to the Black
Mm-hmm.
community, the racialized community, talk about things like that. That will create that space, that will create those conversations and keep going, because it's a good conversation.
Mhm.
It's absolutely a good conversation, and it's a needed conversation to
Yeah.
have in this space. Daniel, any thoughts?
No, I really I'm sort of like absorbing. So your comments about allyship, because I know like Nabeel and I, in the role we have, we interact with so many different people, and we serve in many cases the role of connector, supporter, and it gives the illusion, right, that we are, yeah, that like, the whole ally title and band, like it gives the illusion that we're really helping. But you made the comment about like even when no one's around, right? Like I wonder like how often in my life like I have the opportunity as a white male to serve that role when it's not in my professional lens, right? Like when I have the opportunity to intervene in something, whereas traditionally in my role with the town it would be appropriate, but how much are you actually carrying that through your day-to-day life all the time?
All the time.
And yeah, and I just think that's really, because now I'm unpacking my behavior as a professional and as a person, and trying to sort of navigate, well, when does that end and stop, and if it does, why? And I think that, yeah, and you're right, it is a lot of work, because it's like going to work, you get paid for a reason. It's a lot of work, but taking that with me and through all my life is something that, yeah, I'll definitely walk away with. I love the idea too about not being able to call yourself an ally. That's kind of always ground my gears when you see that in people's like Instagram handles and stuff, and you're like, what is, yeah,
Yeah, you
but
can't throw up a black square on Instagram and call yourself an ally.
yeah,
You can't go to a protest with
right,
a
that's right.
sign and call yourself an ally. Like it's steps, but
Yeah.
you're not there yet. Yeah, it's not there.
No, that's really important for those who are listening. It's, what parts of your identity are still allowing space for racism to occur in your life, be it directly or indirectly, right? And like, and acknowledging your privilege in that. So, working for a municipality, being a white male, being a person of privilege, like how and when are we allowing that to occur,
Mhm,
and and why is that acceptable?
mhm.
Right. And I'm looking at the time, and so we're just about out of time. Janelle, I want to give the final voice, so to speak, to you.
Yeah.
Anything you want to leave us with, Janelle, in terms of just Halton Black Voices, and what are some of the things that we can look forward to from Halton Black Voices? What are things that we can do to work together? Like there's potential of providing some kind of support or training or just a perspective to like sport organizations across, or recreation and culture based organizations across Oakville and Halton in general. Like, so what do we have to look forward to from the wonderful work that your organization is doing?
Yeah, so we got a lot of projects going. We got some great stuff happening in 2021 as well. So currently we've got anti-racist book club starting up, which, the town of Oakville is connected to a whole bunch of libraries. So that'd be great to, get into some connections with that.
For sure.
We'll have like an equity learning space. So this is where Black kids can be taught by Black teachers, which doesn't happen at all in Halton. I don't think my son has never had a Black teacher, has never seen a Black teacher until this year. And she ended up going to a different school partway through the year. So he's never even had that in his environment.
Wow.
So Halton Black Voices is there to kind of create that as well. We're also doing critical and conscious conversations. So just like something like this, where we're really unpacking some stuff, which essentially is going to lead into changing new policies, changing new practices that are happening within the school, within other institutions of power. So it's redistributing that power and privilege to be an equitable space for all.
Awesome. Janelle, thank you so much for everybody else that's tuned in. Thank you guys so much for joining. If you have any questions, this is an opportunity for you to unmute yourself and ask away. I know there was a lot to take in, but I want to provide that opportunity to our audience to ask questions. And if not, we're not going to solve anti-Black racism in the 30 minutes that we have allotted ourselves, right? But we're hoping to start a conversation. You know, for me, I need to reflect in the space in which that I work, in the space in which I understand what allyship really is, and to understand that tokenizing is a very real thing when communities that are being tokenized don't have the demographics that are involved, like that are substantial enough to to have a voice that's more collective, right? Which means true allyship is literally all about standing up when no one's in the room for communities that require you to do so, because you have to be their ally, you have to be their support system, and it's not that you're not doing this because you're a good person, you're doing this because it's the right thing to
Right.
do, right? And I think that's where allyship really comes in. Is that it's not about you, it's about the individual that you're advocating on behalf of or supporting or giving voice to. And I think that's oftentimes what it is. We cheer on the ally and we forget the community, right? And we can't do that. And I hope that's a reflection that I'm going to take away from it. Daniel, any reflections for yourself?
Yeah, definitely. And, part of me kind of, whenever we speak about some of the demographic and statistics, I know, Nabeel, that's you and I really speaking in our world. So like when I use the example about less than 5% of the population being Black, and then we go into these subsidized low income neighborhoods, we see that overrepresentation. I'm always sort of cautious to identify that, because just think of what that does to people who are consuming that information, let alone seeing and that being their lived experience of seeing those populations. So I think the takeaway, which I feel responsible for sharing, is that is not a choice. And it's we have to be intentional about how we are consuming that information as well. Just because someone who works in public office is aware of that demographic does not mean that those individuals, and similar to tokenism, are completely representative of that lifestyle, that choice. That is not a choice. Believe me, no one chooses to live in subsidized housing, line up for food. So even though we're sharing that information about those demographic and statistics, be careful about how you're ingesting that, because that's not appropriate. Like that's not an acceptable statistic for us in our community or in our society. So just because that happens to be true now, doesn't mean it should be true forever. It's not an acceptable statistic, and it's not something that we should just absorb as natural. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, poverty is racialized not because people of color are poor, but because people of color are systemically removed from the opportunities that would make them climb the social ladder, so to speak, right? So racialization of poverty speaks to the systemic barriers and the inability to see that systemic challenges that prevents people from obtaining success is the systemic barrier itself, right? Is the privilege itself, right? So I think that's the work that we need to do. So even when you take a
Right.
narrative like the overrepresentation of people of color in poverty, and you fail to see your own privilege in how you view it, that's the problem, I think, right? And I
Right.
think as a
Thank you.
community,
Yeah.
right, no problem. That's what I'm here for, Daniel. I'm here to work with you.
I just
But
I don't want to embed ideals of norms into people that is unreasonable and unfair. Yeah.
absolutely. So thank you, Gino. Honestly, thank you so much. I personally, you left me so much to reflect with. I know
Yeah.
Daniel has a lot to reflect with. I'm sure people watching and hearing this have too. So thank you so much. And for everybody that's joined in, guys, thank you. This will go up by next week online. So make sure you share it with all your friends, your peers, your colleagues. and all your neighbors, right? So thank you guys. Take care. Have a great one.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Janelle.